Imagine a system built to stop war. An architecture of treaties, courts, and promises meant to make conflict obsolete. Now imagine that system, when tested, choosing convenience over courage. A lot has been said about globalism and institutions like the EU or NATO in recent memory, but many do not know that globalism has been tried and failed before. Tonight we explore the League of Nations, the first time globalism failed, and how efforts to universalize international security are doomed. In Geneva, delegates rose to their feet and spoke solemn vows. Across the Mediterranean, fleets and speeches tried to turn words into action. Yet behind those high ceilings, private deals, porous sanctions, and quiet compromises hollowed out the promise of collective security. The result was a moral rebuke on paper and the continued march of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia on the ground. In our last episode, we followed the lead-up to the Second Sino-Japanese War and watched East Asia tip toward a wider conflict. Tonight, we turn west, tracing how diplomacy, fear, and political calculation combined to let aggression go largely unchecked, and how that failure helped reshape the path to a much larger war. This episode is a calm, carefully researched journey through those months in Geneva and beyond, told in the slow, steady voice you've come to expect. If this style helps you unwind, please like and subscribe, and tell us where you're listening from. Take a slow breath and let's begin. In the peaceful Swiss city of Geneva, which had once long served as the enduring home of the League of Nations, life moved with a quiet steadiness that rarely faltered. The residents had grown accustomed to the steady flow of notable visitors from every corner of the world, and as a rule, these arrivals stirred little more than a passing glance before the city returned to its gentle rhythm. Yet on the morning of September 11, 1935, even the most composed burghers felt a subtle quickening in the air, a quiet thrill that lingered like mist over the lake. A special train glided into the station after its journey from the sunlit French Riviera, carrying two figures whose names alone could capture the imagination across continents. The Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne, travelled alongside his close American friend, Wallis Simpson, and soft whispers soon spread through the morning streets that the vacationing royal might pause at the League's 16th annual session, perhaps lending a touch of regal warmth to an organization whose image as guardian of world peace had begun to show the faintest signs of strain. The waters of Lake Geneva lay calm and reflective under the late summer sky, as the prince stepped from the carriage and made his way directly to a hotel perched beside the shore. There, in the privacy of his suite, he enjoyed a long, refreshing bath followed by a hearty breakfast that restored him after the overnight travel. And after a brief, unhurried shopping stroll along the quiet avenues, he and Mrs. Simpson returned to their private train, continuing eastward toward Budapest, where the warm strains of gypsy violins promised a lighter, more joyful interlude. As the train pulled away from the station and the city slipped back into its familiar hush, the morning might have settled into ordinary calm once more. Yet the day held something deeper in store, a quiet pivot that would ensure the hours ahead carried weight far beyond the royal departure. Later that same afternoon, another Englishman ascended the rostrum within the grand hall of the League Assembly. Sir Samuel Hoare, Britain's Foreign Secretary, had been expected to address the gathering of representatives from 54 member nations, so his presence itself raised no eyebrows among the delegates seated in quiet rows. What no one could have foreseen, however, was the unexpected depth and resolve that would soon fill his words, transforming the moment into something the world would remember long after the session ended, the great hall seemed to breathe with a shared anticipation as he prepared to speak, the afternoon light softening through tall windows, while outside the lake continued its timeless shimmer. And so the stage was quietly set, the morning's royal interlude giving way to an afternoon that would echo far beyond Geneva's tranquil shores. Sir Samuel Herr stood at the rostrum in the assembly hall with a composed presence that matched the weight of the hour. Though he had never been known as a natural orator whose voice could stir hearts like rising wind, something far more enduring emerged through his words that afternoon, lending them a steady authority that held every delegate in quiet focus. His real flair for performance belonged elsewhere, on the smooth expanse of the ice rink where he moved with expert grace as an accomplished skater, or across polished dance floors where he had once claimed victory in an elegant tango championship that still lingered in memory. Yet the true power of his address came not from any dramatic flourish, but from its honest substance, which more than made up for the even, unadorned tone of his delivery, and seemed to fill the grand chamber with a calm, unwavering light. With surprising openness that caught many listeners off guard, Hoa acknowledged how frequently Britain's intentions drew suspicion around the world. Because the nation maintained far-flung territories across distant continents, observers often assumed its backing of the League served merely to hold the existing order in place and safeguard those holdings, and he faced this perception squarely without evasion or defense. Such doubts, he urged the assembly with quiet conviction, should be set aside once and for all, for they had no foundation in reality. No selfish aims or imperial designs, he assured them, guided Britain's approach in this critical time. Then came the pledge that seemed to anchor everything he had said, offered on behalf of His Majesty's government with unmistakable resolve. Britain would be second to none, he declared, in its intention to fulfill the obligations laid down by the Covenant, carrying them out to the fullest measure of its capacity and strength. As he spoke these final commitments, Hoare brought the flat of his hand down sharply upon the podium, the firm strokes repeating several times in measured emphasis, each one underscoring the depth of his nation's promise. Britain stands for steady and collective resistance to all acts of unprovoked aggression, he asserted, letting the phrase settle before repeating it with the same quiet force. Steady and collective resistance to all acts of unprovoked aggression. The words lingered in the high-ceilinged hall like a solemn vow carried on still air, while beyond the tall windows Lake Geneva reflected the soft hues of the fading afternoon, its surface barely stirring. In that moment, the gathered representatives felt the shift, as though a door long closed had opened onto something steadier and more hopeful than before. A wave of profound relief and fresh hope washed across the assembly hall the instant Sir Samuel Hoare finished speaking. Delegates who had sat for years watching the League drift toward irrelevance rose in a thunderous ovation that rolled through the chamber like distant thunder over the Alps. The sound carried years of pent-up longing for something solid and true. In the midst of that swelling applause, only one man remained perfectly still. Baron Pompeo Aloisi, Italy's envoy, sat motionless, his face a study in quiet reserve, while the ovation surged around him like a living current. One by one, representatives from nations large and small stood and spoke with measured clarity. Each affirmed that if the Covenant's prohibition against aggression were ever flouted, their government would honor its obligations without hesitation. Even the Soviet delegate, Maxim Litvinov, who had joined the League only the year before after long isolation, sounded less guarded than usual. He allowed himself a hopeful prediction that this assembly might one day be remembered as a landmark in the organization's renewed history. For a few luminous moments, the great hall felt transformed. Late afternoon light softened through tall windows, touching polished wood and the faces of men who dared to believe the League could still matter. Yet away from the public fervor, a handful of cautious voices studied Hoare's text with careful eyes, searching for subtle loopholes. They lingered over a passage reminding everyone that the risks of peace must be shared by all nations, and that security could not rest solely on the shoulders of a few. Most delegates set those small reservations aside and embraced the straightforward reading offered by Paul Hymans of Belgium. "The British have decided to stop Mussolini," Hymans observed, "even if that resolve might ultimately require the use of force." In the gentle hush that followed, the weight of possibility settled over the room, mingling with the faint scent of polished oak and the distant murmur of the lake beyond the windows. Later that same evening, when the last echoes of applause had faded from the great hall, and the city lights of Geneva began to glimmer like distant stars across the lake, Sir Samuel Hoare returned alone to the quiet sanctuary of his hotel suite. The room felt smaller now, its walls softened by the warm glow of a single bedside lamp that cast gentle shadows across the polished wood, and the heavy curtains drawn against the night. He sat at the small writing desk, with the typed pages of his speech spread before him, reading and rereading each carefully chosen line as though searching for the hidden source of the thunderous response it had awakened. Outside, the waters of Lake Geneva moved in their timeless rhythm, their surface barely stirring under the cool September sky, while inside the suite, the only sound was the faint rustle of paper beneath his fingers and the soft ticking of a clock that seemed to measure something far heavier than mere minutes. In the days and years that followed, Hoare would speak openly about the true intention behind those words. He had never meant them as a solemn vow that would bind his country to military action. He explained with quiet candor. The speech had been crafted as a deliberate bluff, a carefully measured show of resolve designed to give Mussolini pause and to breathe fresh life into an institution that many already feared was dying. The fervor it stirred had surprised even him, turning what was meant as diplomatic theater into something that felt, for one luminous afternoon, almost like genuine conviction. Yet that very surprise carried within it the seeds of tragedy. The moment in Geneva, so full of hope and ringing declarations, would later be remembered by historians as the point where the League's fragile promise began its final irreversible decline, the instant when bold public words outran private will and set in motion a chain of events that exposed the organization's deepest vulnerabilities for all the world to see. The lake continued its quiet vigil beyond the windows, reflecting the scattered lights of the city as though holding the memory of that night in its still, dark depths. While in the suite the pages of the speech lay silent on the desk, their words now carrying a weight far heavier than their author had ever intended. Word of Britain's firm stand travelled swiftly beyond the halls of Geneva, carrying a quiet promise that seemed to touch distant capitals with unexpected warmth. In Ethiopia's modest highland capital of Addis Ababa, where low buildings of sun-baked earth stretched beneath wide African skies, the message arrived at a most fitting moment. Emperor Haile Selassie and his empress sat together inside the little chapel of their palace, observing the sacred rites of their Coptic Christian faith on what the ancient calendar marked as New Year's Day, a time of gentle renewal filled with murmured prayers for lasting peace that rose like incense in the still air. The coincidental timing felt almost destined, and when the news from Europe reached them in that quiet sanctuary, the emperor turned to his wife with eyes that shone softly in the candlelight. "A wonderful New Year's present," he whispered to her, his voice low yet filled with a calm hope that lingered in the small space long after the words had faded. His spirits stayed remarkably high even after another communication crossed the ocean from Washington. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had sent a measured reminder that Ethiopia numbered among the 62 nations that had signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact back in 1928, each pledging to renounce war as an instrument of national policy. Yet Haile Selassie, a ruler whose travels had given him both a refined taste for fine wines and a keen understanding of diplomatic nuance, sensed the deeper balance at work. He understood that the stern note was meant to appear even-handed, for an identical message had reached Rome at the very same hour, and its true focus rested clearly on the aggressor rather than the threatened land. Far to the north, in the ordered quiet of Berlin, the surface reaction appeared one of studied indifference to all the talk coming out of Geneva, exactly as many had expected from the German leadership. Yet behind closed doors, Adolf Hitler followed every development with rapt and unwavering attention, for he knew that if this sudden call for collective resistance took root, his own far-reaching expansionist designs would need careful rethinking in the months ahead. To the Nazi inner circle, it seemed the member nations of the League burned with fresh determination to confront Italy, and early in October, Hermann Goering shared that impression openly when he remarked to a visiting Polish diplomat, his tone carrying both surprise and reluctant respect, "I wouldn't like to be in the Deuce's skin at this moment." What had prompted Goering's candid observation was a striking display of British naval power that unfolded across the Mediterranean, only a day after Hoare had spoken. More than 100 warships, among them the mighty battlecruisers Renown and Hood, the latter then the largest vessel afloat anywhere in the world, had steamed steadily into the narrow Strait of Gibraltar, their grey hulls cutting clean lines through the blue water, while flags snapped in the breeze. The sight sent ripples of astonishment through ports and capitals alike, and back at the League the last lingering doubts simply melted away. Clearly, it appeared to everyone watching, Britain meant business in the fullest and most resolute sense. The Mediterranean itself seemed to hold its breath in those hours, its ancient shores reflecting the silent strength of the passing fleet under a sky that stretched wide and serene. On the eve of the invasion, as twilight settled over the ancient rooftops of Rome, Benito Mussolini stepped onto the balcony outside his office in the bustling heart of the city. Below him a vast multitude had gathered, their faces turned upward in eager anticipation, while the warm evening air carried the low hum of thousands of voices rising like a living tide. He spoke without any formal declaration of war against Ethiopia, a deliberate choice that carried its own quiet edge of contempt for the adversary waiting across the sea. Instead, he turned his words toward the critics gathered far away in Geneva, letting his voice roll out across the square with measured disdain that seemed to echo against the stone buildings and linger in the fading light. "Not only is an army marching," he told the crowd, his tone rising with conviction, "but 40 million Italians are marching in unison with this army, because an attempt is being made to commit against them the blackest of all injustices, to rob them of a place in the sun." The people below responded with a surge of cheers that swelled through the streets, their enthusiasm blending with the distant sounds of the city settling into night. "Should the League choose to act against Italy," Mussolini continued, he stood ready with clear resolve. "To sanctions of an economic nature we will reply with discipline, With sobriety and a spirit of sacrifice, he declared, the words carrying across the square like a solemn promise, to sanctions of a military nature we will reply with war. The balcony lights cast long shadows as the speech concluded, leaving the crowd energized beneath a sky where early stars had begun to appear over the eternal city. In Geneva, the response came with a speed and firmness that surprised even long-time observers of the League. Only a week later, the assembly gathered once more, the same high-ceilinged hall now filled with a different kind of tension, and by an overwhelming vote, the delegates took the historic step of branding Italy an aggressor, the very first time in the organization's existence that such a formal condemnation had been issued. The moment carried a quiet solemnity, as if the weight of years of hesitation had finally given way to something decisive and clear. Then came the next required step under the covenant, the careful process of deciding exactly what punitive measures should be taken against the aggressor. The League assigned that delicate task to a committee drawn from 18 member nations, allowing time for measured discussion behind closed doors while the world watched and waited. A few weeks afterward, the full assembly approved the recommendations the committee had prepared, setting in motion a chain of events whose consequences would unfold slowly yet inexorably across the coming months. Beyond the tall windows, the waters of Lake Geneva caught the late autumn light, their surface calm and reflective as though holding the fragile hopes of an entire era in quiet suspension. When the assembly finally moved beyond condemnation and toward concrete action, the response unfolded with a speed that surprised many who had grown accustomed to the League's more measured pace. The delegates had branded Italy the aggressor in a near-unanimous vote, the first such judgment in the organization's entire history, and then entrusted the delicate task of shaping punitive measures to a committee representing 18 member nations. Weeks of careful discussion followed behind closed doors, and when the recommendations returned for final approval, the full assembly accepted them with quiet resolve, as though the moment might at last translate words into something more substantial. Yet what emerged proved far gentler than the bold language surrounding it might have suggested. Most notably absent was any decision to close the Suez Canal, the single artery through which Italy's supplies and reinforcements flowed directly toward the African theatre. Shutting that vital waterway would have severed the entire campaign at its source, leaving the advancing forces isolated and vulnerable. But such a decisive step remained conspicuously absent from the final list. 3 elements of the sanctions carried an air of seriousness and purpose. Member states were called upon to halt all shipments of arms to Italy, to suspend every financial transaction with the aggressor, and to cease purchasing Italian goods on the world market, actions that promised at least some economic discomfort for the nation waging war. The fourth and final category, however, dealing with the materials nations should refuse to sell to Italy, revealed a strikingly different character. As one wry observer noted at the time, the experts who compiled the list did not appear to be lacking in a certain sense of humor. Among the items solemnly placed under embargo were camels, mules, and donkeys, creatures of little strategic consequence in modern warfare, while aluminum was also included despite the fact that Italy already produced the metal in sufficient quantities to export it to others. While certain industrially useful commodities such as nickel, tin, and rubber were indeed restricted, the most essential foundations of modern warfare remained untouched. There was no ban on coal, no prohibition on iron or steel, and above all, no restriction on oil, the single resource without which the motorized columns, tanks, and aircraft operating deep in the Ethiopian highlands would eventually be forced to fall silent. In the private sessions where these decisions took shape, representatives from Britain and France had argued that depriving Mussolini completely of oil carried unacceptable risks. They feared it might drive the Italian leader into a desperate and unpredictable strike against the British fleet in the Mediterranean, what some quietly called a mad dog attack, capable of igniting a wider European conflict no one wished to face. Other oil-supplying nations such as Russia, Romania, and the Netherlands saw little reason to sacrifice their profitable trade when they knew the United States, standing outside the sanctions framework, would continue providing Italy with all the petroleum it required. Although Congress had quickly passed a neutrality resolution that embargoed arms shipments to both sides after the invasion began, it had deliberately left petroleum sales completely unrestricted, creating a wide and convenient opening that effectively undermined the entire effort. In the final accounting, the sanctions approved by the League amounted to little more than a measured rebuke, strong enough in appearance to satisfy the demand for action, yet porous enough in practice to allow the Italian war machine to continue its steady advance. Far from being weakened by these measures, Mussolini recognized their political value and turned them masterfully to his advantage. He urged the Italian people to embrace a vigorous Buy-Italian campaign, transforming external pressure into a source of national pride and unity that bound citizens more tightly to the regime's ambitions. To help shoulder the growing financial costs of the war, the government invited voluntary donations of gold from the population, and the response came with surprising warmth and sincerity from every corner of the country. In heartfelt public ceremonies held in town squares and city halls across Italy, more than 500,000 wives, often accompanied by their husbands, stepped forward to offer their treasured gold wedding rings to the state. In exchange, they received plain bands of steel, symbols not merely of personal sacrifice but of a shared commitment that transcended individual loss. The clergy, steadfast supporters of the fascist cause ever since the historic reconciliation with the Vatican in 1929, lent their own dignified voice to the movement. One particularly moving occasion came when the Bishop of Civita Castellana, after delivering an impassioned sermon in which he gave thanks to Almighty God for permitting him to witness these days of epic grandeur, quietly removed the heavy gold chain that symbolized his pastoral office and presented it directly to Mussolini, completing the gesture with the raised arm salute of the fascist party. These scenes, captured in photographs and newsreels that circulated widely, seemed to infuse the entire campaign with a sense of higher purpose and moral legitimacy that resonated deeply with many ordinary Italians. Through the tall windows of the committee chambers in Geneva, the pale autumn light continued to fall across the tables where the sanctions had been so carefully drafted, while in the distant south the wheels of Italian supply trains kept turning without interruption, carried forward by oil that no resolution had managed to restrict. The contrast between declared intention and actual outcome lingered in the air like a soft, unspoken mist. In the heart of Rome, where ancient stones seemed to watch over every public gesture, Benito Mussolini presented a carefully crafted image of fiery indignation to the world. His public statements carried sharp edges and bold declarations, as though the naval movements in the Mediterranean had genuinely unsettled the Deuce and stirred genuine outrage within him. Yet behind the heavy doors of his private offices, away from the cheering crowds and dramatic balcony appearances, Mussolini remained remarkably composed, his mind working with the cool precision of a man who believed he held the clearer view of reality. Italian military intelligence had quietly obtained sensitive documents from the British Embassy, materials that painted a far less formidable picture of the impressive fleet that had recently steamed into the Mediterranean. Many of those warships, the reports revealed, were far from fully prepared for serious combat operations, their readiness levels falling well short of what their powerful appearance might suggest to outside observers. Satisfied with this inside knowledge, the Italian leader concluded that the grand naval display amounted to little more than an empty gesture. The familiar old naval tradition, known simply as showing the flag, meant more to impress than to threaten with any genuine force. The Mediterranean waters continued their timeless rhythm under the autumn sun, carrying both the grey hulls of British ships and the quiet confidence of a dictator who felt unshaken by their presence. At dawn on the 3rd of October in 1935, the first light of morning touched the dry hills of Eritrea as Mussolini's forces began their southward advance into Ethiopia. The border between the two territories followed the course of the Mereb River, little more than a shallow trickle winding between low sandy foothills at that time of year, its waters moving lazily under the early sky. Italian troops crossed swiftly, using a pontoon bridge that had been prepared with careful engineering, the structure rising and falling gently with the current as soldiers and equipment made their way to the other side. Almost immediately, the true nature of the landscape revealed itself, for proper roads suitable for motorized vehicles simply did not exist in this rugged terrain, forcing many of the men to dismount and continue forward on foot across the uneven ground that stretched before them. Yet no one seemed to mind the extra effort, for the entire expedition carried the buoyant spirit of a grand parade rather than the grim tension of war. Bright banners fluttered in the morning breeze, while trumpets blared out bold, triumphant notes that echoed across the dry hills, filling the air with energy and purpose. Adding warmly to this festive atmosphere were the native Eritrean tribesmen who had eagerly joined the Italian columns, their voices rising in spontaneous songs and rhythmic dances as they moved forward with visible enthusiasm. Driven by their own long-standing rivalries with their Ethiopian neighbors, the sun climbed higher over the African landscape, casting long shadows across the marching men, while the sounds of celebration mingled with the steady rhythm of boots upon the earth, creating a scene that felt strangely alive with anticipation rather than dread. On a crisp Saturday morning in early December 1935, Sir Samuel Hoare stepped down from the train in Paris, the winter air carrying that sharp, clean bite he always associated with journeys north. He was travelling from London toward the Swiss Alps for a long-awaited ice skating holiday, the kind of peaceful escape where the world's troubles seemed to dissolve on the smooth, mirrored surface of a frozen lake. The brief pause in the French capital offered more than rest. It provided the perfect, discreet moment to meet with France's Premier, Pierre Laval, and quietly explore whether a shared path forward might still exist in the East African crisis. Hoare had never felt entirely at ease with Laval. The man's habitually stained white tie and that sly, watchful manner always left a faint shadow of discomfort. Yet in their conversations that weekend, a surprising warmth and alignment took hold, the kind that can emerge when two seasoned leaders sense the same gathering storm and choose, for a time, to face it together. By Sunday evening, as pale winter light softened across the rooftops and the city settled into its quiet dusk, the two men had shaped a plan they believed could gently persuade Mussolini to bring his Ethiopian campaign to an early and honorable close. Their confidence rested on private exchanges with Baron Aloisi, Italy's representative at Geneva, which had quietly suggested the duchy might accept a reasonable settlement if the terms appeared generous enough. Under the proposal, Italy would receive far more Ethiopian land than its forces had yet occupied. 60,000 square miles would be transferred outright into Italian possession. Another 160,000 square miles, embracing virtually the entire southern half of the country, would be set aside as a reserved Italian zone of economic expansion and settlement, offering space for colonists and development under Rome's guiding hand. Haile Selassie would keep his ancient highland realm, the original mountain kingdom that had defined Ethiopia for centuries, its rugged plateaus rising like a natural fortress above the lowlands, in exchange for yielding the more fertile plains below. Ethiopia would at last receive a long-cherished outlet to the Red Sea, a corridor that could breathe life into its isolated economy and connect it to the wider world. Even on this sensitive detail, Hore and Laval stood ready to offer further accommodation. Should Mussolini object to carving the corridor through territory now under his influence, either Britain or France would willingly allow it to pass through one of their own neighboring colonies instead, smoothing the path to peace without additional friction. The plan had been meant to remain hidden, a quiet understanding between two old friends of Europe, until the right moment arrived for governments, the warring parties, and the League itself to give their measured approval. Yet secrets of that size rarely stay contained for long. Alert French journalists caught the first faint scent of the agreement on Monday morning, and by afternoon the story had broken across the wires, spreading like soft winter light through the headlines of newspapers in every capital of the world. By Tuesday, the news had reached Sir Samuel Hore in the remote Swiss village of Zuoz, high in the Engadine Valley, where snow lay thick and silent on the rooftops, and the air tasted of pine and frost. He had come for the simple joy of skating, gliding in wide, graceful arcs across the outdoor rink, while the mountains watched in their ancient stillness. One moment the blades whispered smoothly over the ice, the next a sudden loss of balance, a sharp crack, and Hore lay on the frozen surface with a broken nose. "Too bad it wasn't his neck," muttered one former admirer when word of the accident filtered back to London, the remark carrying the bitter edge of disillusionment that was already sweeping the country. Britons felt the blow more deeply than most. Only a few months earlier, Hore's stirring words in Geneva had made him an instant hero across every political party. Some had quietly spoken of him as a future prime minister. Now the same man stood accused of secretly trading away half an independent nation to buy a fragile peace, and the sense of betrayal cut sharp and clean through the winter air. In Parliament, a Labour member rose with quiet fury and suggested that a new inscription should be placed above the portals of the League. "Abandon half, all ye who enter here, half your territory, half your prestige." A young Conservative member, Harold Macmillan, who would one day hold the office forever denied to Hore, wrote a measured yet devastating letter to the Times. He warned that approving the plan would help undermine the very structure the nation had only weeks earlier authorized its leaders to strengthen. Macmillan drew a quiet analogy. He had never attended the funeral of a murdered man, yet he imagined that at such a ceremony some distinction was still made between the mourners and the assassins. The reckoning came swiftly for both architects of the proposal. Hore and Laval were forced to resign their high offices within days. In keeping with long ceremonial tradition, Hore personally carried the seals of his office to Buckingham Palace and surrendered them to King George V. The king, never one to miss a wry opportunity, looked at him with a twinkle and said, "You know what they're all saying." No more coals to Newcastle, no more whores to Paris. George V later repeated the gentle jest to Hoare's successor, the 38-year-old Anthony Eden, Britain's youngest foreign secretary in almost a century. The fellow didn't even laugh, the king remarked to Eden, shaking his head with a mixture of amusement and mild bewilderment. The Hoare-Laval plan was dead, yet its shadow would linger for years, remembered as one of the clearest examples of the widening gulf between the high ideals of international cooperation and the hard, practical calculations of national self-interest. Beneath the surface of those urgent diplomatic maneuvers lay deeper currents of exhaustion and quiet calculation that guided the choices made in London and Paris. Britain, still carrying the heavy scars of the Great War, approached the unfolding crisis with a profound weariness that touched every level of society. Leaders in Whitehall looked beyond the immediate drama in Africa and saw something larger. If the sanctions already in place somehow succeeded in halting Mussolini, Britain might find itself morally bound to repeat the same costly effort whenever another border flared or another treaty was tested. That prospect felt almost unbearable to a nation still healing, still remembering the long lists of the fallen and the empty chairs at family tables. The government simply did not relish the idea of becoming the world's constant policeman, forever called upon to risk lives and treasure in distant quarrels that seemed far removed from the daily rhythms of British life. Across the Channel in Paris, the reasoning followed a different yet equally careful path. French governments, one after another since 1919, had lived with a single, unrelenting obsession, the fear of a Germany reborn and rearmed, stronger and more dangerous than before. Despite the clear limits imposed by the Versailles Treaty, German military strength had been quietly rebuilt for years, and once Hitler took power, all pretense vanished. Rebuilding the armed forces became his loudly proclaimed goal. France's long-term strategy rested on a delicate chain of strategic friendships with countries ringing Germany's borders, and Italy occupied a vital link in that chain. To alienate Mussolini risked driving him straight into the arms of the one leader French statesmen feared most, and that possibility haunted every conversation in the Quai d'Orsay. The broader French anxiety shaped everything. Memories of invasion and occupation still lingered in the collective memory, and the thought of facing a revitalized German threat without reliable partners felt intolerable. Keeping Mussolini close, even at the price of compromise in distant Ethiopia, seemed a small and necessary insurance against a far greater danger looming to the east. In the softly lit salons of Paris and the wood-panelled rooms of Whitehall, these two streams of concern flowed together into the same quiet decision. Better to offer Mussolini a face-saving settlement now than to risk pushing him toward Berlin or exhausting Britain in endless future commitments. The appeasement that emerged was not born of cowardice alone, but of a sober, almost weary realism shaped by the terrible lessons of the previous war and the gathering shadows of the next. These motives, so carefully weighed in private, explained why the bold public words spoken in Geneva could so quickly give way to the discreet bargaining that followed. Britain sought to avoid becoming the permanent guardian of a fragile peace, while France sought to preserve a fragile alliance against a resurgent Germany. Together they shaped a policy that hoped to contain the crisis without igniting something far larger, even if that hope required bending the very principles the League had been created to defend. The winter light falling across the desks in London and the maps in Paris carried a soft, almost melancholy glow, as though the rooms themselves understood the heavy cost of such calculations. In the quiet hours when the weight of history pressed upon him, Benito Mussolini often turned his thoughts toward Ethiopia as the one remaining stage where Italy could finally claim its rightful place among the great powers. He carried within himself a deep, almost personal conviction that his nation had been cheated at the peace tables after the Great War, left with little more than scattered patches of desert, while others divided the world's richest territories, and this sense of unfinished destiny burned steadily beneath his public thunder. The African highlands, ancient and proud, represented to him not merely land, but a symbolic redemption, a chance to erase old humiliations and to build an empire worthy of Rome's eternal name, something he spoke of in private moments with the same quiet intensity he reserved for his most cherished dreams. Italy's earlier stance toward Ethiopia carried a striking irony that few outside the inner circles of diplomacy ever fully appreciated. When the question of admitting the ancient kingdom into the League of Nations arose in 1923, it was Italy herself who cast one of the warmest votes in favor, arguing that this proud highland realm deserved its seat among the family of nations, and that its inclusion would strengthen the very principles the League had been founded to uphold. The gesture had seemed generous at the time, almost magnanimous, yet within little more than a decade, the same government would find itself preparing to test those same principles against the very country it had once championed. In 1928, the two nations had even signed a formal treaty of friendship and arbitration, a document filled with warm promises of mutual respect and peaceful settlement of any future disputes, the ink still fresh enough in memory to make later events feel strangely discordant. The treaty had been celebrated in both capitals as a model of enlightened diplomacy, a bridge between Mediterranean ambition and African sovereignty, and for several years it appeared to hold the promise of genuine cooperation amid the shifting sands of international relations. Then came the incident at Walwal, a remote watering hole deep in the disputed borderlands where Italian and Ethiopian forces clashed in late 1934. What began as a small skirmish over grazing rights and control of a few desert wells quickly grew in the telling, until Rome presented it as a deliberate provocation, an intolerable affront that demanded satisfaction. Mussolini seized upon the event with careful precision, transforming a minor frontier dispute into the public justification for a campaign he had long privately envisioned, allowing the pretext to unfold slowly and deliberately, like the opening movement of a carefully composed symphony. The dry winds that swept across the Ogaden plain in those months carried more than dust. They bore the faint, almost imperceptible shift from treaty language to the steady drumbeat of mobilization, a transition so gradual that many observers still hoped reason might prevail until the first columns began their southward march. Through every layer of these motivations ran Mussolini's unshakable belief that Italy's future greatness required not only resources but the restoration of national pride, the kind of pride that could only be reclaimed by planting the flag where Roman legions had once dreamed of venturing. The personal and historical threads wove together so tightly that separating them became impossible, each reinforcing the other until the decision to move against Ethiopia felt less like choice and more like destiny fulfilling itself in the clear African light. Yet even in the private stillness of his study, where maps lay spread beneath a single lamp and the weight of centuries seemed to gather in the shadows, the Deuce understood that history would judge not only the outcome, but the means by which ancient promises had been set aside in pursuit of modern glory. High in the ancient Ethiopian highlands, where the air carried the scent of eucalyptus and distant rain, Emperor Haile Selassie issued a summons, that echoed across valleys and plateaus like the voice of history itself awakening. Everyone will now be mobilized, the proclamation declared in measured yet unyielding tones, directing all boys old enough to lift a spear toward Addis Ababa, while warning that any man found lingering at home once the order arrived would face the severest penalty, a stark command born of desperate necessity as the Italian columns pressed ever closer. The response that followed revealed the true mosaic of Ethiopian resistance, a living tapestry woven from centuries of warrior tradition and the raw urgency of the moment. Seasoned fighters from remote provinces arrived with the quiet confidence of men who knew every ravine and ridge as an old friend, their spears and shields gleaming under the highland sun, while a handful carried antiquated rifles passed down through generations. Yet the greater part of the gathering force consisted of hastily summoned levies, young and old alike, many still wearing the simple garments of daily life and relying more on courage and intimate knowledge of the land than on modern arms or formal drill. Italian agents, moving with calculated patience through the borderlands, understood these human complexities far better than many outsiders ever would. Long-standing tribal resentments, particularly among the Azabu Gala, who had nursed grievances against Central Amhara authority for generations, proved fertile ground for discreet offers of gold and promises of local autonomy, turning old rivalries into quiet fractures that weakened the unity Haile Selassie sought to forge. The emperor himself acknowledged the painful reality with a rueful phrase that captured both the tragedy and the stubborn loyalty still burning in many hearts, calling the phenomenon bribery without corruption, a recognition that some men might accept Italian coin yet never truly sell the soul of their homeland. As the campaign ground deeper into the interior and early setbacks mounted, command shifted to Marshal Pietro Badoglio, whose arrival brought a colder, more methodical discipline to the Italian effort. Under his direction, the skies above the highlands grew darker with the steady drone of bombers, while canisters of mustard gas began to fall, a silent horror that lingered in the soil and seeped into the lungs of defenders unprepared for such invisible weapons, turning narrow passes and open meadows into places of sudden, choking despair. The collapse that followed came with startling swiftness in the opening days of March 1936. What had been a determined, if uneven, resistance seemed to dissolve almost overnight as coordinated air attacks and chemical assaults shattered the fragile cohesion of the Ethiopian forces, leaving villages abandoned, supply lines severed, and the proud highland armies scattering into the rugged terrain they once knew so intimately. Beyond the tall escarpments, the wind continued its timeless whisper across the plateaus, carrying away the last echoes of organized defense, while the ancient kingdom faced a new and bitter chapter in its long story of survival. The city arrives at the end of a long, iron road. Dust settles like a slow exhale, motor engines hush, flags hang heavy in the heat. The columns that had thundered across the highlands come to rest at the gates of Addis Ababa, and with them arrives a new order that will be announced in triumph and sealed in silence. Pietro Badoglio's mechanized advance reached the capital on the 5th May 1936, a culmination of the campaign that had been driven by strategy, by propaganda, and by weapons that the defenders could not match. The march was both spectacle and statement, a demonstration of force that turned into occupation as banners were raised and proclamations read. The emperor had already left. Haile Selassie was not in the city when the foreign troops entered. He had gone into exile, carrying with him the weight of a nation and the clarity of a witness, In Geneva, weeks later, he stood before the Assembly of the League of Nations and spoke with a voice that was at once regal and human, measured and urgent. His words were not merely a plea for redress, they were a moral indictment of a world that had the instruments to stop aggression and yet chose restraint, convenience, or silence instead. Selassie, a man who had been sovereign in his own land, now addressed an international body whose charter promised collective security, and he did so with the calm of someone cataloguing wrongs and the sorrow of someone naming betrayal. He described the suffering of his people, the methods of war used against them, and the failure of institutions meant to prevent such violence. The speech was a lantern held up to the face of the world, and it burned with a clarity that made the surrounding darkness more visible. 2 weeks after that address, the international response that many had hoped for began to unravel. Sanctions that had been imposed in principle were loosened, and recognition of the new reality in the Horn of Africa spread among states that weighed interest against principle. The measures meant to punish aggression proved porous. Commerce, diplomacy, and the calculus of power found ways to bypass moral injunctions. The result was not only the occupation of a capital, but a lesson in the limits of collective will. Addis Ababa, a city that had been the heart of an ancient polity, now threaded with foreign patrols and the quiet of people learning to live under new rules. There were faces that remembered coronations and harvests, and there were faces that now learned the language of curfew and caution. The city's light changed, not in a single dramatic instant, but in the slow accretion of small humiliations and the steady erosion of autonomy. Haile Selassie's closing words to the assembly carried a prophetic chill. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." Those words were not merely a lament. They were a warning about the contagion of impunity, about how the failure to check aggression in one place becomes permission elsewhere. He spoke of a fragile architecture of peace that required more than treaties and resolutions. It required the courage to act when action was costly and inconvenient. There is a lesson here about the perils of a global order that is all procedure and little backbone. When institutions exist in name but lack the resolve to enforce their own rules, they become theatre rather than shield. The machinery of diplomacy can be elegant on paper and impotent in practice, and the result is a world where power, not principle, writes the next chapter. This is the danger of globalism untethered from moral clarity. Networks of interdependence that assume mutual restraint can instead amplify the reach of the strongest, leaving the vulnerable exposed and the promises of collective security hollow. Yet the human story persists within these geopolitical failures. Exile is not only a political status, it is a private geography of memory and longing. The emperor carried with him the faces of those who had stayed, the names of villages and valleys, the cadence of prayers and the taste of familiar bread. His speech was a bridge between that intimate geography and the public square of international law, and in that bridge lay both grief and dignity. The aftermath was not a single headline, but a slow, unspooling consequence. Recognition of conquest by some states, the easing of sanctions, and the quiet resumption of trade all combined to teach a hard lesson. When the world's institutions are unwilling to bear the cost of their own principles, those principles become negotiable. The moral architecture crumbles not with a single blow, but with 1,000 small compromises, each justified by expedience and each eroding the foundation a little more. In the end, the Italian entry into Addis Ababa and the exile that followed are more than historical events. They are a parable about responsibility. They remind us that institutions must be matched by will and that laws require enforcement.